Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 9, Testing and Individual Differences. This is kind of a continuation of Chapter 4, the Cognition chapter that we just covered. Now, theories of intelligence. In order to first talk about what type of theories are out there, you have to kind of know what intelligence is. Intelligence is our overall cognitive abilities, which includes our thinking, reasoning, and problem-solving skills, where we all are different on. Now, this is based on a lot of times the experiences that we've encountered throughout our lives. Now, in order to define intelligence, you have to be able to measure. And measurement basically is going to dictate, a number. And a number is what separates different people in terms of their intellectual strengths. Now, Sir Francis Galton was the father of what's something called psychometrics. And psychometrics is the measurement of knowledge and the ability. He is pretty much the architect of the testing that we use today. Now, he believed that intelligence was genetic, and he referred to this as eugenics. Now, this again, when I say genetic, he believed that was nature, or people's natural ability was given to certain types of intelligence. Now, he did only study males, which often biased a lot of his research from modern-day psychologists when they look back. Now, again, here's the typical question. Who was the first psychologist to propose that intelligence is a result of nature? And most of you, as you're eyeing the screen right now, Robert Sternberg, Howard Gardner, Charles Spearman, and Sir Francis Galton is your answer, and that is letter D. Now, Charles Spearman used what was called factor analysis. And factor analysis is a type of measurement that shows how two factors are related. Okay, so in other words, how somebody's intelligence is related to their gender, or how somebody's intelligence is related to how they were raised. So a factor analysis looks for relationships among factors, and what he found was that there was a single intelligence called the G factor, which means if you were intelligent in one area of your life, you were intelligent in all areas. Now, he also stated that there were specific intelligence or specific knowledge of a subject referred to as S that added up to the G factor. Now, just to kind of make sense out of Charles Spearman's theory, the G factor is kind of like your grade point, your overall grade point, and the S factors are kind of your individual courses that make up the G factor. Now, how you interpret what he just stated was he simply said, if somebody has a high intelligence, a high intellectual number, then no matter what they do, they're going to be successful at it. Whether it's mathematics, whether it's verbal, whether it's reading. Now, if you look at the example I just gave you, if somebody has a high GPA, like a 4.2, then no matter what they do, whether they become an engineer, a nurse, a doctor, a teacher, they're going to be successful at it. Now, most of you listening to this would say, well, I don't necessarily agree with that, and that's a good point. Now, again, which of the following best illustrates Spearman's concept of G? Lisa does well in mathematics, but poorly in chemistry. Think about what I just talked about. Fatma does not know the capital of her state, but can compose music successfully. Juan is an excellent baseball player who has received a scholarship to play in college. Sarah has maintained straight A's throughout high school. Chris is an excellent actor and singer. Now remember, G is an overall number. Okay? And an overall number would be very similar to Sarah has maintained straight A's. In other words, she has an overall high GPA. The rest of these are individual talents, which again, what Spearman said was the G factor is a single determinant, and if it's high, no matter what you're doing, you're going to be successful. Now, L.L. Thurston was another person who investigated intelligence. And he basically said there has to be more to what Charles Spearman said. There cannot just be a single determinant to intelligence. There has to be more to it. And what he came up with, Thurston came up with 7 primary mental abilities, or PMAs. And these are sets of independent intellectual abilities that each person possesses. And the thing is, the key part here, varying degrees. So out of these 7 primary mental abilities, some people might be strong in one ability, but not as strong in another ability. Now, he separated and simply said that people have strengths and then they have things that they're not, very strong in. Whereas Spearman just believed in one overall, single determinant for intelligence. Now, Daniel Coleman, where he's most known for, is he believed that emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive and manage the emotions of oneself and others. Coleman believed that this type of intelligence is, what is correlated with people becoming the most successful. People that can not only handle themselves, but also deal well with other people. And again, emotional intelligence is very important in order to be successful in life because often you have to work with other people. Now, which of the following would score high on the emotional intelligence test? In other words, which one of these describes it the best? Jacqueline can complete crossword puzzles quickly. Claude is good at interpreting the emotions of others. Pauline is good at fixing mechanical machines. Marcus knows how to make spaghetti. Ellie has invented a new device to help others learn to read. And this one is pretty simple. Obviously, that's B. The emotional intelligence is knowing one's emotional level as well as interpretation. Now, J.P. Guilford agreed with Thurston, but thought that he oversimplified human beings. In other words, Guilford thought 7 is too little. And remember, Thurston believed that Spearman, simply that's, what 1 wasn't enough. Guilford came up with 180 different types of intelligence. And again, he used a factor analysis like Charles Spearman. Now, most people, including myself, think that's excessive. Now, the most popular theory was Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence. And this is one you need to know. Often you will see questions on it. And basically he said, like a triangle, there's 3 types of intelligence. Analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and practical intelligence. Now, analytical intelligence is, kind of correlated to your book smarts. Specifically, a lot of times, your math and science courses. This, a lot of times, deals with your problem-solving ability. Now, creative intelligence is your ability to generate new ideas. And this is kind of thinking outside the box. Okay? Now, a lot of times, creative intelligence often correlates to people's electives. All right? Elective courses often have you think outside of the book or outside of the box. And some people do very well in their elective classes. Now, practical intelligence is the ability to interact with one's environment or street smarts. Okay, it's been called. Practical intelligence, people just feel comfortable in their environment. They're very good at navigating their way through, certain parts of, the environment. They're able to relate well to other people in the environment. They are somebody that is kind of like a people person. Now, a good way to remember Sternberg's theory, the 3 parts specifically, is think about Sternberg. He wore a thinking cap. Okay, when I say thinking cap, C for creative, A for analytical, and P for practical. Now, here's a good question from Sternberg's theory. Ava excels in her art class, but has tremendous difficulty in math and English. According to Sternberg, Ava displays what type of intelligence? Now again, she excels in her art class. Is that analytical, B practical, C creative, D general, or E emotional? Now again, if you're trying to figure this out, remember, this kind of class requires, art class specifically, requires you to think outside the box, so to generate new ideas. So most of you, when you're thinking about that, obviously you can connect art with creative, and the answer is C, creative. Now, another question from Sternberg's theory. Jason received a low score on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which we'll talk about that test in a moment, but is capable of navigating his way through a busy city without the assistance of a map. Okay, so right away you should be asking, this is somebody that's very good in their environment, that works well with other people, that is able to kind of get around certain places without asking for too much help. Which one of these kind of correlates to street smarts? Is that creativity, analytical, practical, emotional, or general? Now again, practical a lot of times not only is it called street smarts, but it also been called common sense. And if you guys picked C on that one, you were correct. Now, another popular theory of intelligence, in fact, a lot of people agree with this one, was Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence. Multiple intelligence believes that there is more than one type of intelligence. Now remember, Guilford had over 180. That was way too excessive. Gardner's theory is pretty practical in terms of dividing it up into the different types of intelligence. Now, Gardner's theory was based on people who suffered traumatic brain injuries and had damage to one area, but they were still able to perform other types of abilities. And so what he was able to say is, even though one part of the brain gets damaged, the person is still able to function at other levels, which means that there has to be separate intelligences. Now, some of them, just to go through them, and very, very few times you'll have to be asked to recall this. Linguistic is the ability to learn and use language. Some people are fluent in more than one language. Logical mathematical, that's very comparable to Sternberg's analytical intelligence. Musical, okay, compose and play music. Some people are very gifted in terms of playing an instrument. Body kinesthetic, that's physical ability or hand-eye coordination, and some people excel in that area. Spatial, they do well in classes like geometry with spatial relations. Interpersonal, which you're going to hear that word a few times in this class, and people often get confused with intrapersonal. Is interpersonal, the E in there stands for everybody else. So interpersonal understands the emotions of others. So just remember the E in interpersonal stands for E, everybody else. Intrapersonal, the ability to understand one emotion. I always say you would always give yourself an A in whatever you would rate yourself. So when you look at this interpersonal ability to understand one's emotions, you always would give yourself an A. That's a good way to remember it. And then naturalistic, people that are kind of one with the land or one with the environment. Now, other influences of intelligence. Obviously, we started this off with Sir Francis Galton's notion that intelligence just comes from nature alone. There is some support that intelligence is supported on the nature side of the argument. Okay, kinship studies, which kinship studies look at people that are biologically related, have found that identical twins show a strong correlation or relationship between their scores and simply the fact that they're related, even if they were raised in separate environments. So even if the twins were separated, one twin was raised in one type of environment, the other twin was raised in another, they still brought back, at a certain point, will have the same intelligence score. There's also the Seattle longitudinal study, which used a cross-sectional design of adults. Again, comparing people. That's what a cross-sectional design does. Over 40 years, it found little or no change in their intelligence scores, which again supports the nature argument. So in the Seattle longitudinal study, they brought these people back over a period of 40 years, and their intelligence score never fluctuated or changed. Now, nurture, basically says that kids who were adopted often start to have a moderate correlation to their adopted parents. So in other words, a child was adopted, raised with their adopted parents, and often started to mimic or become very similar to their type of intelligence. So that would support the nurture side of the argument. Now, here's a good question. Professor Yanders recently conducted a study that examined the IQs of 1,000 different families. He concluded that if parents had high IQs, their children would also have high IQs. Now, Professor Yanders believes in which view of intelligence? So in other words, does Yanders support nature or nurture on this one? And that obviously comes down with B and C. Now, when you look at the question, you conclude that if parents had IQs, their children would have IQs. He is supporting, obviously, the nature side of the argument, that the intelligence is passed down from their parents to their children. Now, in terms of testing individual intelligence, coming up with a score, which obviously, when we looked at the beginning of this lecture, psychometrics, that was the idea that you had to establish a score to explain intelligence. Alfred Binet wrote the first modern intelligence test, and it was designed to assist the French government in identifying special needs students. Now, he believed intelligence can be determined by a mathematical formula. First of all, he said mental age was determined by the number of right answers on a test, which then divided by the chronological age, would give you a sense of a person's IQ. Now, the problem, as one gets older, the chronological age doesn't, it keeps on going. People get older, they can't stop, obviously, going from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8. The problem is their mental age does not change often, And remember the Seattle longitudinal study. Their intelligence remained the same. But when you have a divisional factor like that, and the chronological age keeps on going up and the mental age stays the same, you are going to have a variation of a score. Now, the psychologists who developed the first modern intelligence test to use the French government with the placement of special needs students, most of you are looking at this, and this, answering these questions are very good because if you notice up to now, there's a lot of people mentioned in this chapter. Most people already eyeing the screen, Alfred Binet. I always say a good way to remember Alfred Binet wrote the first intelligence test is most people strive to get an A or a B on a test. So A for Alfred, B for Binet. Now, other people that contributed to testing intelligence, William Stern proposed multiplying the score from MA to CA by 100. which resulted in the intelligence quotient. So Wilhelm Stern is simply given the fact that he came up with the IQ. He's given the credit. Now, if a child's MA and CA are the same, their IQ would be 100, which is the norm. Okay, that's normal IQ. Louis Terman at Stanford University translated Binet's test into English. This resulted in the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale, which was a very popular test for a long time. Now, David Wechsler modernized the intelligence test, and is one of the most popular tests used today. And he developed ways to measure intelligence in children, which is called the WISC, and adults called the WAIS. Now, he set out to address the criticisms of the Stanford-Binet test, the biggest one being that chronological age kept on going up and mental age remained the same. Now, he created two separate tests, the verbal test, which included word definitions, math, and memory, and performance test, which included 7 subtests that required manipulating objects and assembling pictures. So verbal test really looks at kind of, going back to Sternberg's theory, kind of looks at the analytical type of intelligence, whereas the performance test kind of looks at the creative and the practical parts of intelligence. So we found a test that covered all 3 areas. Now, the scores of these 2 tests are averaged, then compared to people of the same age. Unlike the Stanford-Binet test, which used a formula, and that's key. Basically, that's why Wechsler's test keeps on going as people get older, because, again, it's compared to people in the same age group, okay? And then based on how that comparison is made, a person is given a score. So if they compare better than the average of their age, they have a higher IQ. If they compare worse than the average of their age group, then obviously they have a lower IQ. Now, most of the scores fell between 90 and 110. Or another way to say it, 1 standard deviation of the average. Okay, and that's often asked on questions, or that's often asked on tests and questions, is that most people fell between 1 standard deviation of the average or the mean. Now, Bailey recently took the WISC and scored 1 standard deviation above the mean. Bailey would most likely have an IQ of, okay? Now, 1 standard deviation, 15 above the mean, so which one does it come out to? Most people would have said A, being that the average is 100. 1 standard deviation ahead is 115. Now, 2 different types of tests, which most people are familiar with. Aptitude tests are designed to measure a person's performance or potential. It makes predictions. Okay? For example, the ACT makes predictions of how people are going to do in college. So I always say the P in aptitude stands for prediction. Prediction or performance. Achievement tests are designed to measure a person's knowledge of a particular subject area. For example, AP tests. AP tests, when you take the test in May, are measuring your amount of accumulated knowledge that you were supposed to require throughout the course or throughout the semester you were there. Now, some types of test advantages and disadvantages. Individualized tests, which is obviously individually given to a person. The test taker, these are the advantages. The test taker can dictate the flow of the questions, in other words, go at their own speed. There's greater rapport between the test administrator and test taker. So in other words, the test taker can ask questions. Now, the disadvantage of an individualized test is the test is more expensive because obviously it's individualized. You have to give one to everybody. Often it's time consuming because it takes a while to score them and everything else, as most people know with getting their scores back. And there's only a test, you can only test 1 person at a time. So again, it takes a while to complete. Now, the group test, it's easy to administer to large groups of people. Scoring is objective and it's inexpensive. However, the disadvantage of taking a group test is there's less rapport between the person taking the exam and one giving it. In a group setting, most people are not going to often ask too many questions. Responses are more restricted. There's test fatigue, and the subject does not know or cannot dictate the flow of the questions. Now, here's a good question. Together with 200 other high school students, Claude is taking a time test that is said to predict how well a person will do in his or her first semester in college. Claude is most likely taking what type of intelligence test? And I think as you're looking at the question, okay, together with 200 other high school students, most of you would say that's a group test. Now, here's a good question from the previous slide as well. Which of the following is not considered an advantage of an individualized intelligence test? And again, reading this question, what's an advantage of an individualized intelligence test? They allow good rapport between the test taker and the person administering the test. If the person is having a bad day, they can often be rescheduled to accommodate these circumstances. They are cheap and easy to administer. And we kind of discussed that. You're making a lot of individualized tests. I don't know if that's cheap. The test taker can help dictate the pace of the test. If the test taker has a question, he or she can ask the test administrator for clarification. Now, most people in here would have said cheap and easy, okay? And that's, the one part are more expensive and time consuming, okay? Now, which of the following is a disadvantage of the group intelligence test? They are relatively cheap to administer. They can be administered to numerous people at the same time. There is considerable rapport between the test taker and the test administrator. Test fatigue may cause a low test score. The test is given in a controlled environment. Again, here it is, disadvantage, and that is, the answer is D. Fatigue causes a low test score. Now, this chart right here deals with measuring test. Reliability is by definition that if you give the test over and over, you are going to get the same results. Now, here's the thing. If you took the ACT in September and then take it again in March, reliability says that you're going to get roughly the same score. And a lot of times people who do take that test twice do get the same score. Now, in terms of measuring reliability, you can use the example I just gave. Give the test repeated times, okay, once every couple months to see if it's reliable. Or you can do split half reliability and simply compare, for example, the evens with the odds, or compare the first 50 with the second 50. Okay? Now, validity deals with how well a test measures what it was designed to measure. If you say a test is valid, then that test is measuring what it's designed to measure. Okay? Now, there are several subtypes of validity. Content validity, information included on a test measures what it was designed to measure. So, for example, if there's going to be questions on intelligence, if the lecture's on intelligence, then the questions to the lecture have to be on intelligence. So if you sat down to take a psychology test and all of a sudden there was, mathematical questions on there, that test would not be considered what we call content validity. Criterion or predictive validity is the ability of a test to predict how well a person will do in the future. Okay? And a prime example of this, Adam took the ACT, which predicts he will do good in college. So, criterion or predictive validity is those questions are designed to see how they are going to do down the road. If I wanted to put some predictive validity questions on a test, for example, if we have, we're taking a test on biological psychology, and I put a few questions at the end that deal with more or less cognitive psychology, how you score on those questions will give me an indication for how well you're going to know the cognitive material. Now, construct validity is how the test is designed, constructed, to measure specific theory. The questions were in small font, making it hard to answer. The questions were in different order, and the students found it very difficult to follow the rhyme or reason. One of the things that students will often ask, that's a good example of construct validity, is do the questions go in order of the book? Okay? Because obviously that helps them in terms of when they study. When a teacher scrambles the questions, that makes it a lot tougher on the kids to kind of make rhyme or reason with how they're doing. Now, standardizing or standardization is the process of setting a common standard by comparing one score to those obtained by a pre-tested group. For example, in my class, I have previous classes that have set the standard, if you want to set it that way, where I always compare the present group of students to the previous group. Because what that allows me to do is simply see how well you're doing in the course compared to people in the past, which tells me either I have to adjust my teaching or adjust the test or adjust the amount of time I'm spending on certain topics. I often use this example. When you have a really good basketball player come through, he sets the standard in which all other basketball players from that point forward are going to be compared to. Okay? So when you hear, well, he's not as good or he's better, they're being compared to a previous group. So when you hear a test has been standardized, all right, that means it's been given to a prior group in order to draw comparisons from. Again, that prior group sets the standard. Now, good question. Aaron is taking a final exam in his calculus class. All the questions on the exam relate to material that was covered over the course of the year. Therefore, the test is said to display high. And again, is that criterion validity? standardization, reliability, content validity, test-retest validity. Now, key here, all the questions on the exam relate to the material. Another word for material, while you're trying to figure this out, is content. So that's content validity. Another good question from that chart, Garrett scored a 28 the first time he took the college entrance exam. 6 months later, he took it again, scored a 29. Because the scores were so close together, the test would be considered. Now again, here's the thing, he scored a 28, took the test again, that's key, took it again, scored a 29. So think of it this way, while you're trying to figure out what it is. If you have a friend pick you up at 8 one day, then he picks you up at 8 the next day, and picks you up at 8 the next day, you would say that friend is, there's your answer, reliable. Now, example bias do exist on tests, okay? And unfortunately, it's not a perfect system. Culturally, some people might not be, familiar with certain ways of asking certain types of questions or presenting certain types of content. Some questions tend to be tied to specific colleges, often, or cultures I should say, often the culture of the place where they're taking the exam. Now, also, SES level or social economic status can play a role. Room temperature, school situations, personal situations. Many factors can roll into this. Some of you are saying, those sound like confounding variables. Variables that you don't have control over a lot of times, and you don't. You don't have control what happens before a test, during a test, after a test. Some things are just out of your control. Now, in terms of diversity in cognition and creativity, creativity is the ability to generate novel ideas. Think outside the box, as Robert Sternberg talked about in his triarchic theory of intelligence. Now, two examples of creativity are people that are, show divergent and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is the ability to generate multiple ideas or solutions to a given problem. Okay, and this is kind of your prime example ability to think outside the box. I always say a good way to remember divergent is DI for discover, discovering new ideas. Okay? Convergent is narrowing down to a single best solution or answer to a problem. So convergent, again, to converge on something is to come together on something. Often, here's a good example of divergent and convergent thinking, your Friday nights. You come up with multiple things to do, that's divergent thinking, and then you narrow it down to one single idea, which usually takes 5, 6, 7 hours to do. But eventually, you use convergent thinking to narrow everyone's choices down to one. Now, there's a good question from that. Which of the following best illustrates the concept of divergent thinking? So right off the bat, you should be looking. Divergent thinking means to discover, come up with new ideas. Hank is good at listening to other people. Gloria is an excellent softball player. Tony does extremely well in school, but can't make friends. Richard knows the lyrics of every song he's ever heard. Ellie designs workplace accommodations for the physically impaired. So divergent is coming up with new ideas. So most of you, again, obviously Ollie coming up with different ways for people to live in a certain area, that would be an example of divergent thinking. Now, gifted label equates to an IQ of more than 135. And some people do have it. Lewis Terman conducted a longitudinal study, which again is a long-term study of 1,500 10-year-old children. He called them Terman's termites for some reason, which this level of IQ, and then recorded their progress over 60 years. Now, following his little Terman's termites, only 11 kids out of that 1,500 did not graduate from high school, and most received advanced degrees like doctorals or masters. Terman died. IQs are more likely to succeed in life than are those with low IQs. Which psychologist would most likely agree with Mr. Trevor? Was that Goldman, who we talked about was emotional intelligence, Lewis Terman and his little termites, Sternberg, Chomsky, or Festinger? Now most of you, just being that we just talked about it, Terman was the one who studied gifted children the most. Now in terms of this chart, this deals with people that are mentally challenged. Okay? And obviously the big thing up here is to kind of know the score. People with an IQ of under 70 are labeled with the mental challenge label. Now, if they fall between 50 and 70, approximately 85% of people that are mentally handicapped fall into that category. And they may display few or no physical symptoms, and academic learning is often related to about a 6th grade level. Moderate is an IQ score of 35 to 49. And they do show signs of impaired motor and physical symptoms. They often have to live with a caretaker, and their mental capacity is between someone of 4 to 7 years of age. Severe is an IQ of 20 to 34, constant supervision, limited language abilities, severe impairment, motor and physical functioning, and they have the mental capacity of often a 3 to 4-year-old. And then profound, which is below 20, may be able to feed themselves, but often that has to require assistance. Language is often in some types of cooing or babbling or grunts. They may never learn to walk, and again, the mental capacity doesn't often go beyond 3 and 4. Now again, key thing is 85% of people that are mentally challenged usually do fall into the mild category. Now, 3 factors associated with mental retardation or challengement: Down syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, which we talked about in chapter 3, and Fragile X syndrome. Down syndrome, also known as trisomy 21, is a genetic order caused by the presence of an extra 21st chromosome. Okay, and most people are familiar with Down syndrome. Now, fetal alcohol syndrome is a permanent, that's the key word unfortunately, permanent physical or cognitive damage. Fragile X is a genetic order caused by a mutated gene on the X chromosome, causing cognitive impairments. Okay, and remember, in terms of the Y is usually, comparison with the Y can also cause problems. Now, autism spectrum disorder is often, one of the things that is most studied today. And it consists of 3 main forms: autism, Asperger's syndrome, pervasive developmental disorder, or not otherwise specified. And in terms of the spectrum, there's a range of, different reactions, all of which can have different symptoms. Now, autism is usually diagnosed between 2 or 4 years, and often experiments impairment with social skills and communication. Asperger's syndrome typically displays very narrow yet highly attentive preoccupations with subjects to the point of obsession. Do have above average intelligence, but have problems in school sometimes in terms of the routinics. PDD-NOS shows some symptoms of autism, but not all. Now, there's a lot of theories and a lot of research being done to look at, what contributes to autism, and to look for certain types of treatments in terms of better helping children adapt to the autistic spectrum that they're in. Now, savant syndrome is a cognitive impairment in certain areas, but has 1 or more abilities that are displayed at genius level. It often is used with repetition or counting or memorizing. Now, savant syndrome supports Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence, that certain people that are savant struggle in certain areas, but they excel in other areas, or they can become a genius in one area.